Good evening and welcome to the College of DuPage. This is the College Lecture Series. My name is David Goldberg and I teach political science here at the college. Tonight, 1 week after the conclusion of the 2012 presidential election, we are honored to have NPR White House correspondent Ari Shapiro with us. Mr. Shapiro has worked as a correspondent and reporter at NPR for more than 10 years. Prior to covering the White House for the past 2 years, he covered the Justice Department during some of the most tumultuous investigations of their history. The past 2 years, he's covered the White House, and the past year has worked exclusively for NPR in covering the campaign of Governor Mitt Romney. So tonight he will share with us his impressions about where the things that he saw, as well as where our politics are going, and some colorful anecdotes as well. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the people that make the College Lecture Series possible. The College Lecture Series is supported by the Office of Academic Affairs, the Ron Lemmy College Lecture Series Fund at the College of DuPage, the College of DuPage Foundation, and the College Lecture Series Committee. So please help me in welcoming Mr. Ari Shapiro.
Thank you, Professor Goldberg, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. I am Ari Shapiro, and none of you look like what I imagined either. It is over. I know that not living in a swing state, you may not have been quite as inundated these last few months as our fellow Americans in Ohio, Florida, et cetera, but I think we can all breathe a huge sigh of relief that it is done and that we're not in recounts, no matter which side of the aisle you sit on. I don't know how many of you saw the day after the election, the Obama campaign released a video of President Obama going to his election headquarters in Chicago and thanking staffers. They didn't allow reporters to come along, but the campaign filmed it and released the video. And in the video, as he's talking to the staffers, he starts to cry. And a lot of news organizations were playing this tape because it's really notable. He's wiping away tears. And I think most people watching that probably thought, oh, he's so moved by the work and service of his staff. Those of us who went through the campaign saw that video and thought, oh yeah, of course he's crying. Anybody who just went through that is like on the verge of tears. One little nudge away from a nervous breakdown. Literally at the end of the campaign, we would be waking up at 5 a.m. and going until 2 a.m. Doing 5 swing states a day. You know, we would wake up in Florida, go to Colorado, Ohio, Iowa, Virginia, and then start all over again. At many stops, the Romney plane would land and pull up to a big airport hangar that had been tricked out for a rally with all of the flags and signs and thousands of people waving banners, and we would go down the airplane stairs, go into the hangar, plug in our equipment, listen to the 20-minute speech, unplug our equipment, go back up the airplane stairs, and fly away to the next swing state. And so, you know, I would post on Twitter or Facebook, today we're going to be in Ohio, Denver, Iowa, blah, 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 and somebody would reply, oh, you have to check out the wineries in Grand Junction. It's like, really? And at every stop and on every leg of the flight, they would feed us. I think it was sort of their way of trying to keep us sedate and lethargic. So we would feel really virtuous when we passed up 3 meals a day and be like, oh, I'm slimming, I only ate 5 meals today. And I think there was a consensus among the press corps that our favorite meal of the day was always third dinner, because then you could say, I'm getting thinner. But I'm really happy to be here with all of you tonight talking about this because, first of all, it's part of the recovery program. I'm on step 2 right now of the 12 steps. But also because having spent every day of really more than the last year narrating what was going on day by day, I'm really happy to have this chance to sort of take a step back and describe the entire race course and not just, you know, the mile of the marathon that we happen to be on in that moment. And one way that I looked at this whole project of covering the election was that the election was really just sort of a frame to report on America, the country that we live in and the people who live in it and the issues that face them. And like any work of art, what's inside of the frame is often more interesting than the frame itself. I realize that for a lot of us, our understanding of this country we live in comes from fiction, whether it's Steinbeck and Faulkner novels or The Real Housewives of Atlanta and Miami, which is fiction, by the way. This year, at every rally, I would talk to a handful of people in the audience, just for a few minutes each. None of them were long, in-depth interviews, but I would ask people what was important to them, what was concerning them, what drove them to come to a rally in the first place. And they would open up to me about what was going on in their lives, even if just for a few minutes. And so collectively over the course of this campaign, I think I probably did thousands of these little mini interviews that I came to think of as almost a pointillistic approach to portraying the American experience, where every voice of a voter that I put on the radio was like one drop of paint that on its own didn't show you anything, but when you take a step back and look at it in its entirety, you sort of get a picture of this country that we live in. And there are voices that I will always remember from this past year. I can think of a woman in Ohio who was 56 years old and told me about having been laid off from her job at age 50. And she said that in the last 6 years, she had applied for 400 jobs. She'd had 2 interviews. And she said, now I look at the college graduates who are coming out of school struggling to find work, and they're my competition. And she said to me, I can imagine that if I were hiring someone for a job and I were choosing between somebody with 40 years of experience ahead of them or somebody with only 10 years of work left, I might choose the person just out of college too. But she told me, it makes me feel like less of a person not being able to do the work that I know I'm capable of doing. And so many of these stories had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with partisanship, nothing to do even with the election. In Sarasota, Florida, I met a real estate agent who told me that when the housing bubble burst, his business partner committed suicide, leaving behind a wife and kids, because he had purchased all of these houses at the height of the bubble that suddenly he was unable to pay for and knew he would never be able to resell. And he just saw no other option for himself. And then I heard a vastly different story from a real estate agent in Elko, Nevada. Now, Nevada has one of the highest unemployment rates, one of the highest foreclosure rates, and one of the highest personal bankruptcy rates of any state in the country. Yet in the town of Elko, I met a woman who told me she, as a realtor, was unable to find enough houses to sell to all of the people who wanted to buy in Elko. In Elko, the unemployment rate is down around 3%, and people are making 6 figures all over the place. Because Elko is a gold mining town, and the price of gold is through the roof right now. And so everybody is flocking to Elko, Nevada, hundreds of miles from nowhere, just a speck in the middle of the desert. They're flying there to cash in. And they all know that at any moment, the price of gold could drop, and the boom will go bust, and Elko will dry up and become a ghost town. Sometimes I felt like my microphone and my headset were almost like scuba gear that allowed me to just sort of immerse myself in an ecosystem that I would never otherwise be able to explore. And one of those experiences happened in Daytona Beach, Florida, where Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan were campaigning, but the previous day they had nothing scheduled. So I decided to fly down to Daytona Beach and do a story on the gender gap. Now, people talked a lot in this election about the gender gap when they were describing female voters' preferences for President Obama over Mitt Romney. But there was another gender gap, which was that white male voters overwhelmingly favored Romney over Obama. So the weekend that Romney and Ryan were campaigning in Daytona Beach was an event called Biketoberfest, which is when thousands of motorcycle buffs from around the country come to Daytona Beach to, ride their Harleys all over and kind of take over the city. So I flew down to Daytona Beach a day early and decided to talk to these overwhelmingly white men about why they preferred President Obama, Governor Romney, that is. Now, needless to say, this is not my natural environment. So I landed in Daytona and took my headset and my my microphone, and I went to this tattoo parlor where all these biker dudes were hanging out drinking beer, listening to thrash metal, and I walked up to them and said, "Hi, I'm Ari, want to talk about politics?" And what's amazing is that they said yes. And I remember this one guy was really animated. And he kind of got in my face, not in an aggressive way, but in a really passionate way. And he said to me, "Have you ever been hired by a poor man? Have you ever been hired by a guy on food stamps? Have you ever been hired by a guy who is homeless? No, I don't think so. I haven't either. I've only been hired by rich guys. So why are the Democrats trying to punish people for being rich?" And I thought, all right, well, that's going to go in my story tomorrow. And finally, after all of these interviews, I found one Obama supporter in the crowd who said, he said to me, "I love that when they were going after Obama for his birth certificate, he went back behind their backs and killed Osama bin Laden." And the last line of my story after he said that was, "In this sea of white men, the Obama voter is the true minority." The one voter who probably gave me the most headache was, amazingly, coincidentally, the only voter this entire election who I happened to run into twice. During the Republican National Convention in Tampa, Mitt Romney flew up to Indianapolis from Florida to give a speech at the National Convention of the American Legion. And we went with him, as we always did for every event. And I, in the 5 minutes before he started talking, tried to interview a couple people in the crowd. It was thousands of people from all over the country for this national convention. And I, at random, picked this woman from Virginia out of the audience and asked her, how she was feeling about the election. And she said, "I can't stand the president and first lady. I can't stand to look at them. She doesn't look like a first lady. It's time we get someone in there who looks like a first lady." I thought, wow. And then Romney started to speak, so I ran away and plugged in my equipment, and the next day put that on the radio, and there was a lot of reaction to it, as you can imagine. Some people said it was offensive to the president and first lady that I put that on the radio. I shouldn't have aired it for that reason. Other people said it was offensive to the American Legion, that of all the thousands of people in that room, I happened to pick this one who said something so offensive. Other people said I shouldn't have aired that quote because I left people to assume that she was racist when, in fact, maybe she just didn't like that the president has big ears. And then there were also a lot of people who thought it was valuable and important to put that quote on the air. I subscribed to that view. NPR's ombudsman had a different view and wrote a whole column sort of critiquing my decision to put this woman on the air. But several months later, Romney gave a speech at an American Legion Hall, a much smaller venue, in a Northern Virginia suburb of Washington, D.C. And so I was there recording the event, and after the event, I was packing up my stuff, and this guy taps me on the shoulder, and he says, "You were in Indianapolis, weren't you?" And I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about," because at this point, I barely remembered where I was the day before, let alone months before. And he said, no, you interviewed my wife at the National Convention of the American Legion. And I thought, oh my God, your wife is Bobby Lucier. And I only remembered her name because I had spent so much time, defending my decision to put her on the air. And he said, "Oh, yeah, she's right here." I was like, oh my God. So I have to confess, my first reaction was, run away, you can only get in more trouble. But then I realized, no, as a journalist, God gave me this opportunity. So I went up to her and I said, "Do you remember talking to me in Indianapolis?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Would you be willing to talk to me again?" She said, "Sure." I said, "Did you know I put you on the radio?" And she said, "A friend of mine told me she heard me on the radio." And I said, "I don't know if you're aware, it caused some controversy. People were trying to interpret what you said." And she was like, "No, I had no idea." And I said, "Okay, well, do you remember what you told me?" And she said, "Not really." And I said, "You were very upset about the president and first lady." And she said, "Oh yeah, she's no first lady, and she doesn't look like a first lady." And I said, what exactly do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, she does push-ups, she wears sleeveless dresses, she wears shorts. You can't picture Mrs. Kennedy doing that or Mrs. Reagan doing that." And I said, "Well, some people asked whether there was a racial overtone to what you were saying." And she said, No, absolutely not. I don't care what color she is, she just doesn't behave like a first lady." And then, later, her husband, who didn't want to talk on tape, said to me, "Look, I oppose abortion, and there are people who say that means I'm anti-women. But I'm not anti-women, I'm just anti-abortion. My wife doesn't like President Obama. She's not racist, she just doesn't like President Obama." So I did a second story with Bobby Lucier, and I played the tape from that first event in Indianapolis. I said there was all this controversy, and I randomly ran into her again, and here's what she said the second time. Well, the amazing thing about this moment we live in is that people don't just listen to the radio and have their own internal reactions. People respond online. And people did not respond especially favorably to Bobby Lucier this second time. I think the website Jezebel did a photo gallery of all the previous first ladies in sleeveless dresses. And the website Gawker wrote, "Oh, so she's not a racist, she's just a misogynist." But those were their conclusions. And you know, the thing that I love about what I do is that I get to take people's stories, hear what they say, put it on the radio, and let listeners judge for themselves what to make of these people, whether to agree or disagree with them, whether there's value to what they're saying or not. I've heard listeners say they don't care what some random person in Ohio thinks about the presidential election. They want their elections coverage to be what are the candidates saying and why, which I agree is extremely important. But to me, those voters' voices were often more engaging even than the candidates themselves, even though the voters may have just come off as sort of grace notes to the main tune. So let's look a minute at that main tune now. Actually, for me, one of the most telling moments with Mitt Romney happened on the flight back from that American Legion National Convention where I first met Bobby Lucier. Thanks for this. We were flying back to Tampa for the Republican National Convention, and he came to the back of the plane to talk to us off the record. He'd done lots of press conferences before. At this point, I'd been following him for a long time, and I felt like I knew him really well. Not the way you know a close friend, but the way a biographer knows his subject anyway. And the guy who came to the back of the plane to talk to us off the record was a Mitt Romney that I had never met before. This guy was funny, genial, warm, smart, able to clearly and concisely defend his policies, personally reflective, genuine and human in a way that Romney just never managed to come across in his press conferences or on TV. And after he had this conversation with us, I pulled one of his senior aides aside and said, "Listen, you're really doing your guy a disservice by not letting us film that." And he said to me, no, you don't understand. If you pulled out the cameras, that side of him would disappear. And I thought, well, sucks to be you. I mean, you have to sell this guy to the American people who is somehow incapable of being the genuine, sincere, funny, human, approachable, relatable, likable guy that everybody who knows him personally knows him to be. And I did see that side of him one other time, which was on stage in the first presidential debate in Denver, Colorado. The guy who showed up to that debate was snappy, smart, funny, incisive, able to connect with voters at home, and in that 90 minutes managed to bring what had been a disastrously losing race into a near tie with President Obama. A few days after that debate, the polls were basically even. I think that debate featured two people who are both at their best when people are writing them off for dead. Barack Obama and Mitt Romney are both guys who love to come roaring back when everyone is writing their obituaries. In that first debate, unfortunately for President Obama, everyone was writing Mitt Romney's obituary. So President Obama kind of phoned it in, and Mitt Romney did what he does best, which is come from behind and blow the doubters out of the water. So that began this sort of final 1 month lap with the polls virtually tied. And starting from that 1 month point, what I'd like to do now is rewind the tape back to the beginning and describe all the reasons that Mitt Romney never should have been able to win this race. And then rewind again and tell you about all the reasons that President Obama could never have won this race. And then we'll look at that last chapter and how one of them finally, ultimately defied the odds and did win. Now, Mitt Romney had to engage in this race much earlier than President Obama, obviously because he had a primary. Typically in the Republican Party, primaries are coronations. The old saying goes, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. And Mitt Romney was obviously the next in line. He had run in 2008 and failed. He had spent years building up endorsements, building up money, building up infrastructure state by state. He was in line for the coronation. But the Republican Party was in no mood for a coronation this year. They had just had this insurgent Tea Party wave lead them to take over the House. They believed that for all the reasons I'm going to describe a little later, there was no chance President Obama could ever get reelected. So they thought, why in this year when the Republican Party is on the march with true red-blooded conservatives should we settle for this moderate Massachusetts liberal who used to be pro-gay rights, pro-abortion, pro-gun control, pro-immigration? And so Mitt Romney always kind of chugged along during the primaries with like 20% in polls, while the other candidates had what one person described to me as an Angry Birds race, where one after another kind of like rocketed to the top of the polls and then crashed down to the bottom. So it was like, you know, Michelle Bachmann, Rick Perry, Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum. I can remember the first event that Rick Perry did in New Hampshire. It was in Portsmouth, and he stopped by a coffee shop called Popovers. It was a warm summer day. I remember standing outside watching him greet voters, and I stood there thinking to myself, I am looking at the next president of the United States. Well, to quote Rick Perry, oops. And so so this primary had a couple really negative effects on Mitt Romney. First of all of his rivals defined him harshly early. Rick Perry coined the phrase vulture capitalist. Newt Gingrich came out with this 30-minute video that described Bain Capital, the company that Mitt Romney touted as his business background, his #1 qualification to be president, Bain Capital as this sort of bloodthirsty monster that destroyed American jobs, and Mitt Romney as this cold-hearted capitalist who cared about nothing but money. And the Romney campaign made the really baffling decision not to put out a whole slate of biographical ads. This is standard practice for any campaign. You start out putting ads, introducing yourself to the voters. Well, Romney didn't do that. He put out tons and tons of ads, but they were all attack ads. And the thing about attack ads is they hurt the person they're directed at, but they also hurt the person who's creating the attack ads. Now, they may hurt the person they're directed at more, but Mitt Romney was steadily weakening himself all throughout the primary by putting out all these negative ads. And at the same time, he was depleting his coffers. In order to beat Rick Santorum in the state of Ohio in the primaries, Romney outspent Santorum 10-1. So by the time we got to the general election, Romney had far, far less money to use in the ad wars than President Obama did. Now, late in the race, all the way in August, the campaign finally decided they were going to do the biographical, introduce Mitt Romney to the country work that they had not done up until then. So they created this beautiful 10-minute biographical video of their candidate. It included him and his kids and his wife Ann talking about raising 5 sons, talking about getting her diagnosis with multiple sclerosis. It was beautiful, it was moving, and it was positioned to reach a huge audience. It was slated to air the night of the Republican National Convention in the hour when Mitt Romney spoke. It was going to open that hour. And remember, the networks were only carrying 1 hour a night. So this was like the biggest hour of the biggest night of the Republican National Convention, so everyone would see this beautiful video. Except that at the last minute, the campaign had a much better idea. You know where this is going? So they decided to bump the beautiful, glossy biographical video introducing Mitt Romney to the American people to the earlier hour, and when nobody was watching. And in the hour where the biographical video was going to go, instead, they had Clint Eastwood talking to an empty chair. So by the time Mitt Romney finished the primaries, his favorability rating was in the gutter. Andy Kohut, who runs the Pew Research Center, wrote in the New York Times, "No candidate in the modern polling era with personal favorability ratings as low as Romney's has ever won the presidency. With a 29% rating, he is far and away the least personally popular presidential candidate since pollsters have been regularly checking favorability ratings." That is not what anyone wants to hear. I want to talk a little bit more about the ad wars, too, because to me, this was a really fascinating part of the presidential race this year. I spent a week in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which was regularly in the top 10 advertising markets, just looking at the ad wars. And I talked to one local ad guy there who told me a story from 2008. He said in 2008, He tried to go place a 30-second ad in Colorado Springs that typically would have cost him $300 to $500. And the guys at the local news station said, oh, no, since this is the election season, that $300 to $500 ad is going to cost you $1,500. And he was ready to pay it, except that at the last minute, a national campaign swooped in and paid $7,000 for the slot. So that was 2008. In 2012, Colorado Springs saw 3 times the advertising that they did in 2008. This year totally blew every previous record out of the water because there was a smaller number of swing states than ever, and there was more money than ever. And the day after the election, that money is worthless. So everyone was dumping it into these states. Somebody who oversees advertising at a local news station in Denver told me they budget their annual expenditures in 2-year cycles because they know that in an election year they can afford a satellite truck or new camera equipment, and they can't in the previous year. But you can't exactly count on it because a state like Pennsylvania was the biggest state for advertising in 2008. This year it was basically off the map. North Carolina was not a swing state until Obama eked out a win in 2008. This year, it was one of the biggest advertising markets in the country. Wisconsin was not on the map this year at all until Paul Ryan joined the ticket, and suddenly it was flush with cash. There was another interesting difference between the way Obama advertised and the way that Romney advertised. President Obama had very tailored niche messages. He had as many as 20 ads in rotation at once, which is unheard of. He had this message for women, this message for seniors, this message for students, this one for Latinos. They had a couple of dozen different Spanish language spots, whereas the Romney campaign just had 3 or 4. That's because the Romney campaign ran on this one message of the economy is broken and we'll fix it. And because that's a rather universal message, they put it in high-traffic shows that cost a lot to advertise in. So the Romney campaign was advertising on the nightly news and the morning newscast and shows that everybody watches that cost a lot of money. The Obama campaign was getting more bang for its buck by advertising on Spike TV to reach young white men, on Univision to reach Spanish speakers. I did some really difficult investigative research while I was in Colorado Springs, and I watched Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, to find that, yes, indeed, there were Obama ads on Here Comes Honey Boo Boo to reach that niche audience. So the Obama campaign may have had, I don't want to say the Obama campaign had less money to spend, but the Democrats had less money to spend, but they spent it in slightly savvier ways. The Obama campaign actually had more money to spend than the Romney campaign, but they helped make up the difference with the outside groups where the Republicans raised more than the Democrats. One more reason that Romney had a really difficult row to hoe this election season. If we were to put together a Romney Greatest Hits album, a few of the track titles might include Corporations Are People Too, My Friend, I'll Bet You $10,000, My Wife Drives a Couple of Cadillacs, I'm Not Concerned About the Very Poor, I Like to Fire People, and that doesn't even touch on the 47% video. The 47% video was a smorgasbord of things Romney wishes he had not said. Let me read you just part of this toxic statement. Quote, and remember, this was filmed in a fundraiser that he thought was private and the video got leaked. He said, "There are 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what, who are with him, who are dependent upon government, who believe they are victims, who believe government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they are entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it, that that's an entitlement and the government should give it to them. These are people who pay no income tax." By the way, it's true that 47% of people pay no income tax, but they pay many, many other taxes. It's also true that there was about a 47% base of Obama support. Strangely, though, the 47% of people who pay no income tax are much more overwhelmingly Republican than Democrats, so he got his facts a little bit mixed up there. Anyway, then he went on, "My job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives." So it wasn't just that Romney seemed to dismiss about half of the electorate in that quote. It was also that it played right into the stereotype people were painting of him as this out-of-touch, wealthy corporate elitist who didn't understand the plight of the middle class. And this video came out just a couple weeks before the first presidential debate. So remember, going into that debate, Romney was the biggest loser you can imagine. And in that one 90-minute period, he turned the race on its head. So, having gotten there, let's rewind the tape again and talk about all the reasons President Obama never should have won. Certainly the president had gaffes of his own. Remember, you didn't build that, or the private sector is doing fine. Like the Romney gaffes, some of these were taken out of context, some of these were misconstrued. But what's interesting is that at the end of the day, they didn't take hold in the same way the Romney gaffes did. In early October, after all of these gaffes had had a chance to sort of play out for a while, NBC and the Wall Street Journal asked people what they thought of the "you didn't build that" quote. Let me read you the context of it. This was at a campaign event. Obama said, "If you have been successful, you didn't get there on your own. There was a great teacher somewhere in your life. Somebody helped to create the American system that allowed you to thrive. If you have a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen. When we succeed because of our individual initiative, but also because we do things together." So the Republicans hammered that. They even put one day of their campaign, the theme was, "We built that." So NBC and the Wall Street Journal did this survey where they read people the entirety of the "you didn't build that" quote and asked, does this make you feel more positively or more negatively about the president? The result was surprising. 36% of people said it made them feel more positively about President Obama. 32% said it made them feel more negatively. 26% said not much difference at all. Then they asked the same question about the 47% quote. Once again, they read the entire thing in context. And 23% of people said that quote made them feel more positively about Romney. 45% said it made them feel more negative. So even though both candidates had their gaffes, for whatever reason, Romney's gaffes seemed to take hold in a way that the president's did not. Really, the biggest reasons that, in the view of Republicans, President Obama never should have won this race and had no chance from the beginning have to do with underlying economic data. The government started keeping track of the unemployment rate in 1948. Okay, since then, the country has had a total of 82 months with unemployment above 8%. 43 of those 82 months were under President Obama. That's more than all of the other presidents combined. Or you can just look at economic growth in the last quarter of a president's term, okay? In George H.W. Bush's last quarter, and remember, he did not win re-election, the economy grew at 3 times the rate of the Obama economy. So you can understand why Republicans thought this incumbent president has no chance of winning with the economy that we have. No president since World War II has ever won re-election with unemployment above 8%. We did finally get just below 8%. Now the unemployment rate is 7.9%, but still. Okay, since 1968, only 6 presidents have run for re-election with unemployment above 6%. And of those 6 presidents, 5 of them lost. The only one who didn't was President Reagan. His unemployment rate was over 7%, but over the course of his first term, the unemployment rate dropped almost 3 full points. So, finally, we got below that 8% threshold in September. The unemployment rate dropped to 7.8% before ticking back up in October to 7.9% as more people entered the workforce. That jobs report was just a couple days after the first presidential debate, and I remember thinking, which is going to be more consequential in this race, the debate or the jobs report? Well, the jobs report didn't budge the needle. The debate moved everything about 4 points in the polls. And one thing that was really interesting to me, being with Romney, was that as I went to rallies and talked to people about the unemployment rate dipping below 8%, they were all 100% confident that this was machinations by the Obama administration to manipulate the unemployment rate. Now, as a member of the reality-based community, allow me to hereby assert that that is not possible. And so I would say to these people, you do know that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is totally insulated from the White House. There's no way there could be political manipulation of these numbers. And they would say to me, nothing is beyond the reach of the tentacles of the Obama administration. They would say this with a straight face. And I would say, okay, so let's say for a moment that he could manipulate the unemployment numbers. Wouldn't he get it down to like 5%? Like, I mean, 7.9% is still pretty high. Or like, wouldn't he do it a few months ago? Like, why wait until the 9th inning? And like literally, I would say this to people, and they would say back to me, "You don't want to be too greedy." But even with unemployment below 8%, there were profound reasons to doubt that President Obama could ever get reelected, and Mitt Romney reminded people of them every day. 23 million people unemployed, underemployed, or given up looking for work. Half of all college graduates unable to find jobs commensurate with their education. These are profound economic problems that have not gone away. Now, the Obama campaign was quick to point out that we came out of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Things were improving, albeit slowly. And so all of this brings us back to that first debate. That first debate where the Romney campaign believed that what the American people wanted to see was a viable alternative to President Obama, which they presented. And there's something really interesting and surprising about this, which is that the Romney campaign's theory of this race had always been that their path to victory was to make it a referendum on President Obama. That if voters went into the polling place and they thought, President Obama, thumbs up or thumbs down, then Romney would win. And the Obama campaign's theory of the race was always that in order to win, they had to make it a choice election. That if people went into the voting booth and they thought, do I prefer Obama or Romney, then Obama would win. And yet, Romney's arguably strongest moment in the entire campaign was a moment of choice, when Romney and Obama were on stage together and people were able to compare the two. And Obama's arguably strongest moment of the election during the Democratic National Committee was a referendum moment when he was up there defending his own record in a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of way. So coming out of that debate, the race essentially tied. What brought us to an Obama victory? Well, there are a lot of policy reasons that people could argue, and President Obama and his campaign certainly have, that the American people endorsed his balanced approach to budget cutting, his all-of-the-above approach to energy policy, all of the other substantive issues that he was talking about on the campaign. You can argue that the reason he won Ohio was the auto bailout. 1 in 8 Ohio workers is in the auto industry. But apart from the policies, there were a lot of structural reasons that he won as well. Let me give you a few key numbers on this front. In the state of Ohio, the Obama campaign had 131 field offices. This was according to some research the Atlantic Monthly did. 131 field offices in Ohio. In the Romney campaign in Ohio had 40. In Florida, the Obama campaign had 106 field offices. Romney had 47. In Virginia, so these are the 3 most important swing states now, all of which Obama won. In Virginia, Obama had 61 field offices. Romney had 30. The Republicans kept saying our ground game is so much better than it was in 2008. And that's true. But the Democrats had a better ground game than they did in 2008 as well. And there was another difference in the ground game, which had to do with party registration. In most swing states, Democrats registered far more new voters than Republicans did. But the Democrats still had a big worry. Obama campaign manager Jim Messina kept saying, if all of our people turn out to vote, then we'll win. But that was a really big if, because statistics throughout history have shown that Democratic voting groups, young people, minorities, etc., are much less likely to vote than Republican voting groups, which tend to be older, which tend to be white. Chances are, if you're a registered Republican, you're going to go to the polls. If you're a registered Democrat, you're a little less likely to go to the polls. And so this difference came out at every rally. I would go to an Obama rally, and he would say, all right, guys, you can register to vote until October whatever. You can start early voting on October this day. Your polling place is here. The hours are this. We have buses outside afterwards to take you, et cetera, et cetera. At a Romney rally, he would say, I need your vote. Go vote for me. There was one thing Romney did consistently at every campaign stop. He would say, I need you to find someone who voted for Obama in 2008 and convince them to vote for me this time. Because he knew that in order to win, he had to flip all of these 08 Obama voters to become 12 Romney, he had to flip the 08 McCain voters to become 2012 Romney voters. And that meant he couldn't just bash President Obama because he needed to convince people who used to like President Obama that, in the words of one ad that the Karl Rove Super PAC Crossroads put out, it's okay to break up with him. One more thing made a big difference in this election and will continue making a big difference in future elections, and that's demographics. Mitt Romney's path to victory, and in fact every recent Republican path to victory, depends on a wide margin of victory among white men to make up for the president's, the Democrats' advantage among women and minorities. A colleague of mine told an interesting story about being at the Iowa State Fair with a Republican candidate who was eating a fried pork chop on a stick and looked around at the crowd and said to my colleague, "This is the real America." And my colleague looked at him and said, "No, it isn't. The real America is Chicago and Los Angeles and, you know, the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. The real America gets 2% less white every 4 years and 2% more minority every 4 years. And so a Republican Party that depends entirely on turning out a base of aging white male voters is a Republican Party that does not have a long future in this country. In 2008, President Obama won 2/3 of the Latino vote. Anybody know how much he won this year? 3/4. The Republican Party knows this. And they know that to keep winning national elections, they have to change course. And so it's going to be really fascinating to watch what happens in the next 2 years as there is sort of this tension, this tug of war, perhaps a civil war within the Republican Party, as some people try to de-emphasize policy positions that alienate women and minorities. Some people try to change the policies that are alienating women and minorities. The Tea Party takes the lesson from the 2012 elections that, well, look, in 2010, we nominated a Tea Party slate of candidates and roared back to take control of the House. In 2012, we nominated this Massachusetts moderate, and we lost. You do the numbers. The mainstream Republican leadership in Washington says, this is the year we were supposed to regain control of the Senate. But because of extreme statements by people like Richard Murdoch in Indiana and Todd Akin in Missouri, these were the comments about legitimate rape and pregnancy caused by rape being God's plan, because of those kinds of comments, Democrats actually gained seats in the Senate. I mean, I wasn't covering the Senate races this year, but I really believe that the Senate story is almost as important as the presidential story this year. This was a year Republicans were supposed to take control of the Senate, and instead, not only did Democrats keep from losing as many seats as would have lost them control of the Senate, they actually gained seats. So this was something that actually both candidates, the Latino issue, the demographics issue, both candidates talked about this, interestingly, when they thought they were not being recorded. In the 47% video, Mitt Romney said, quote, "We're having a much harder time with Hispanic voters, and if the Hispanic voting bloc becomes as committed to the Democrats as the African-American voting bloc has in the past, we're in trouble as a party and, I think, as a nation." And President Obama did an interview with the Des Moines Register, which was off the record until, under pressure from the paper, he agreed to put it back on the record. And when he thought he was off the record, he said, quote, "Should I win a second term, a big reason is because the Republican nominee and the Republican Party have so alienated the fastest growing demographic group in the country, the Latino community." He said, "This is a relatively new phenomenon. George Bush and Karl Rove were smart enough to understand the changing nature of America, and so," he said, "I'm fairly confident they're going to have a deep interest in getting immigration reform done." And it's true, George W. Bush in 2004 won 40% of the Latino vote, more than any Republican since then. Now, I don't know the politics of this crowd, but I can safely assume that some people are rejoicing that their guy is in office for another 4 years, and some people are mourning the fact that their guy narrowly missed getting to the White House. Let me offer a little bit of perspective. I'm not going to argue that the presidency doesn't matter. Of course, it's hugely consequential who is president. But both of these men have spent the last 4 years trying to paint this as a stark black and white choice. Polar opposites that will put America on completely different paths going into the future. And there is an element of truth to that, but there are also profound ways in which these two men are more similar than they let on. One of these ways occurred to me in September. I switched off the Romney campaign to spend a few days with the Obama campaign and was dumbstruck by the fact that both of these men at every rally talked about their 5-point plan to solve the biggest problems facing America. And I could not believe when I realized they have the same 5 points. I'm not kidding you. Point number 1 is increase trade abroad. Point number 2, improve education. Point number 3, get America energy independent. Point number 4, reduce the deficit. Both of them say these same 4 things. And on point number 5, they diverge. President Obama talked about national security. Mitt Romney talked about small businesses. But even on national security, I don't know if you guys watched the foreign policy debate, but on national security, Romney and Obama agreed on Iran sanctions, on intervention in Syria, on the way they should have handled Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, on drone strikes, on the 2014 withdrawal date from Afghanistan. I mean, a huge range of issues here. Now, of course, the fact that both men say they want to reduce the deficit doesn't mean they would take the same approach to reducing the deficit. The fact that they both say they want energy independence does not mean they would have the same energy policy. But the fact that they agree on so many of the fundamental problems facing America, at least what those problems are, if not exactly how to get to the solution, I think is really striking. A colleague of mine named Adam Davidson started NPR's Planet Money project, and he writes a column in the New York Times Magazine, and he did something about the similarities between these two men on economic issues. So he pointed out that Romney seeks a top tax rate of 25%, Obama seeks a top tax rate of 28%. Basically a rounding error, right? Romney wants wealthy investors to pay 15% on capital gains taxes. Obama wants a 20% tax rate. As Adam says, neither man has a plan to radically change the way we regulate business, the environment, or the workplace. He had this great quote from Jonathan Coleggio, who's the communications director for Crossroads GPS, the super PAC that Karl Rove ran. And Coleggio said, if you were selling a new cola and you told people it tasted like Coke, nobody would buy it. So, to the classic Coke fans in the audience, congratulations, you get another 4 years of your drink of choice. But to the new Coke fans in the audience, take heart. It's possible that even if your guy had won, it wouldn't have tasted that different from classic Coke. With that, I would be happy to take your questions. Thanks very much for your time. I think we have 2 microphones in the front, so if you want to just come down the aisles and come up to the mics, we can just sort of alternate sides. And I'm happy to answer questions about the election, but also about journalism, about NPR, about covering the White House, whatever you're curious about, I'm happy to expound on. If you just make your way to the microphone over there, then we'll make sure that, or on either side. Yes, go ahead.
So you had said that you spent some time with him, you feel like you kind of knew Romney. And you also said that at one point he started kind of as a moderate, kind of went to the conservative, and seems to have gone back to the moderate. So just your personal opinion, where do you think he really is?
I think he's really a Massachusetts moderate Republican who cares deeply about fiscal issues and not at all about social issues.
Thanks.
That's my personal take, yeah. But you know, one question that the Romney press corps was sort of asking ourselves at the end of this whole thing is, could any electable Republican, meaning a Republican who could have won a national race, have made it through the primary process this year without being pulled so far to the right that he would have been disqualified for a general election? I say disqualified in sort of a, you know, abstract sense. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. My question is for you. Can you explain the Electoral College? Like, I understand it and everything.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, how you took that in regards to like the election and everything.
I mean, thank God the popular and electoral vote went the same way this year. Otherwise, it would have been, you know, 2000 all over again, but people complaining in the opposite direction if Romney had won the popular vote but lost the electoral vote. So, I mean, the impact of the Electoral College is that all of the campaigning happened in 8 or 9 states. And I sort of think about what this presidential campaign would look like if it were based solely on the popular vote. And I have to think that as much money was put into advertising this year, even more money would be put into advertising and even less money would be put into campaigning. The one thing that I do have to say for the Electoral College is that it forces candidates to actually meet people and interact with voters. I mean, you know, people in Ohio expect to kind of shake hands with the guy that they are ultimately going to vote for. And there's something valuable, I think, about making a candidate campaign in that way and not just sort of speaking on television to 60 million people. The Electoral College forces them to do that and forces them to engage in that one-on-one way. But obviously the system has huge problems too. I mean, I'm not advocating for one or the other, but I don't see the system we have going away anytime soon.
Okay. No, I was just asking.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I watched the first two debates, and it felt like both candidates repeated what they said in the first debate. They repeated in the second debate. And then they say, oh, Mitt Romney won the first one, oh, Obama won the second one.
Yeah.
But if you listen, they said same things.
Right. So it has often, there was some actual study that has entered just sort of the popular wisdom as the thing everybody knows about debates now, which I guess is actually grounded in science, but I just know it as the thing everybody knows about debates, which is that if you watch it with the sound off, you can identify the winner. And which I really think is true. And it's true that their positions didn't change from one debate to the next. What changed was that Mitt Romney seemed less on his game in the first debate. President Obama seemed less like he was phoning it in the second debate. Romney was confident and on point and clear and concise in the first debate. President Obama was persuasive and aggressive and witty in the second debate. None of those are policy differences. Their policies did not change from debate 1 to debate 2. But whereas in debate 1, Mitt Romney took more centrist positions on certain things than he'd taken before. For example, he said, my health care plan includes coverage for people who are uninsured. That's true only if people have, sorry, not uninsured. He says, my health care plan includes coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. That's only if those people with pre-existing conditions have consistently had insurance all along. In the first debate, President Obama let that slide. In the second debate, he said, actually, Governor Romney, and called him out on it. So there was no change in positions, but there was a big change in style and tone, which I think is why people thought that the second debate went for President Obama and the first one went for Mitt Romney. Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the Supreme Court's opening the floodgates on campaign finance? And do you think there's any correlation between that and the perceived growing corruption of our government?
Honestly, a year ago, the big narrative was, this is the year of Citizens United. This is the year that corporate money is going to flood and distort everything. And from my perspective, that's kind of the dog that didn't bite. The Republican outside groups raised far, far, far more money than the Democratic outside groups. To some extent, though, that just made up for the huge deficit that Mitt Romney ended the primaries with. And Romney ended up raising less money than Obama did. And so even though Democratic groups raised less than the Republican outside groups, at the end it was roughly equal. Also because the Democrats were advertising in these niche markets, their money went a little bit farther. And then the last thing that sort of balanced it out is that just because of a quirk of federal law, campaigns pay a lower advertising rate than outside groups do. And so the fact that the Obama campaign raised more money than the Romney campaign and the outside Republican super PACs raised more money than the Democratic super PACs meant the Republicans' money didn't go as far as the Democrats' money, because the Democrats' money was disproportionately coming from the campaign, not the outside groups. So I'm not saying that it makes no difference, but I don't think it fundamentally swayed the shape of the race in the way we expected. Just one more note about this. One of the biggest donors of this campaign was Sheldon Adelson, and he committed to giving some insane amount of money. I don't remember the exact figure now, but let's say it was $100 million over the entire course of the campaign. He owns casinos in Vegas, and his total net worth is public. So at some point in the race, I calculated what $100 million as a percentage of Sheldon Adelson's net worth would be for the average American. Because we know how much money an average American makes, and we know how much money Sheldon Adelson makes, so I figured what would a comparable donation be for an average American? And it was a little over $300. But Sheldon Adelson's guy lost, so yeah.
From your bio, it looks like you've worked for NPR most, if not all, of your career.
My entire career,
okay.
Yeah.
Without, in an impartial way, if you can you kind of make a comment on how NPR presents the news and reporting versus commercial networks
Yeah.
cable, et cetera?
Well, I mean, I think, honestly, the best way to answer that question is to listen to a full 2-hour broadcast of Morning Edition or All Things Considered and compare that to, on any given day, the New York Times, the nightly news, an hour of CNN, an hour of Fox. And I can tell you what our values are, and I think everybody has to evaluate for themselves whether we succeed at executing those values. We want to present a thorough, complete, informed view that describes all of the perspectives on the issues of the day. We want to create a more informed public. We think of what we do as a public service, and we take that very seriously because we have this bizarre business model that entails telling people that we hope they like what we do and asking if they will give us money to do more of it. And so at the end of the day, the only people we're accountable to are the American people. And our listenership divides pretty evenly into about a third, Republican, Independent, Democrat. And every day at the editorial meeting, the question we ask ourselves is, what's important? What do listeners need to know? What's the best way for us to tell this story today? Whether it's an interview with a newsmaker or a piece from a reporter or something else. And there are moments out there that NPR becomes kind of like a football for people who want to use it to achieve whatever kind of ends they want to use it for. Fortunately, I kind of do my job independent of that, and I don't have to worry about it. But hopefully, our work speaks for itself and sort of affirms that we are helping keep the American public informed, educated, surprised, delighted, entertained, and a responsible citizenry, I guess.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a political question. How do you think the legalization of weed in Colorado and Washington will affect the 2016 election or even the nation?
Well, I mean, so it could be a crack in the firmament. Certainly we saw that with medical marijuana, that more and more states have started following the path of, I guess, California was the first state to legalize medical marijuana. And so it could be something along those lines, although the Supreme Court, the last time it visited this, kept marijuana Schedule I controlled, I think it was called Schedule I controlled substance, and Congress seems to show no sign of budging. But, a lot of new movements start at the state level. One big question I have is, in 2004, the Republicans used gay marriage ballot initiatives as a way of turning out their base voters to help propel President Bush to re-election. Is it possible that marijuana initiatives could turn out Democratic voters in large numbers? I don't see that as quite the same kind of mobilization force that evangelical Christians to the issue of gay marriage could be. But I wouldn't completely rule it out. I'm not sure. I mean, it's an interesting question. I just don't know.
Early in the campaign, I think it may have been around the convention possibly, somebody on the Romney team was being asked about Romney's position on different issues, and they brought up the analogy of an etch-a-sketch.
Oh yeah, that was Eric Fernstrom.
And did that stick? Did it go away? Or
oh, it definitely stuck. I mean, the word etch-a-sketching was everywhere. It became a verb. The problem with that was that it was, such a perfect metaphor for what everybody had been accusing Romney of all along. I can remember the first Romney event after that, I showed up, and outside of the event, this woman who was Rick Santorum's spokeswoman was handing out mini etch-a-sketches to everyone in the audience. Newt Gingrich showed up on stage with an etch-a-sketch. I mean, it was just such an evocative image. It was such a compelling metaphor for what he was accused of doing that then every time he changed position on anything, oh, well, there he goes etch-a-sketching again. So yeah, I thought that was a really damning moment. Yeah.
Okay, I keep on hearing after this whole debate that we have now become a nation more divided. Now, I've even heard this on NPR, but what's your take? Are we really a nation that has become more divided?
Our government has become more divided. The people are not more divided. House districts are drawn so narrowly along blue and red lines that people no longer have to win general elections to be elected to Congress. In more and more cases, they just have to win their primary to be elected to Congress because they represent an overwhelming Democratic or overwhelming Republican district. And to win the primaries, you just go to the far extreme of your party. And so then you get elected to the House of Representatives, and the people who are representing us, a largely purple, centrist, moderate nation, have been chosen by the most extreme elements of their respective parties. So I'm not sure what the context of the NPR quote was, but no, I don't think the country is more divided than ever, but certainly our government is more divided than ever, and I attribute that largely to this sort of gerrymandering.
There was a CBS poll for the presidential debate, and 37% said that Obama was in favor and 30% Romney, but there was a 33% for undecided. And I know you've had interviews with a lot of voters, and I wanted to know your opinion on what possibly was the topic that was or was not covered that gave these undecided voters their, like, which way they wanted to go.
Yeah, so that was one question that kept coming up, especially in the later days of the campaign. How could an issue with so much saturation, you know, you couldn't turn on a TV or open a newspaper without hearing about the presidential election, have left anyone undecided? And just from my anecdotal experience, there was no single profile of an undecided voter. You know, I met people who really liked President Obama a lot and were really struggling in the economy and just couldn't decide whether Romney was a good enough alternative or not. Up until the last minute, they were still struggling to decide. I met a woman in Colorado who said to me, look, I'm a woman and I'm a small business owner, and she voted for Obama in '08. And she said, as a small business owner, I feel like the Democrats are trying to get all up in my business with taxes and regulations, and as a woman, I feel like the Republicans are trying to get all up in my business with all their stuff about contraception and healthcare and abortion. So for some people, there were two very compelling issues that pulled them in different directions. Now, in that specific poll, I think a third of the people watching a debate might not have an opinion about whether President Obama or Mitt Romney won the debate, but it's not that a third of voters were undecided. There was a very, very small percentage of undecided voters in this campaign, even early on relative to other presidential campaigns.
Were there certain expectations you had over the victory of one candidate or the other as to how that affect, I guess, you professionally as a reporter? Or how do you have to reassess?
Well, I mean, frankly, I knew that if Mitt Romney won, it was going to be a whole new marathon starting the minute that the other marathon ended, because the transition is a huge thing. You know, what's the future of all of the Obama policies that the Governor Romney had promised to repeal? Who would be the incoming cabinet members in a Romney administration? All of the promises of what Romney would do on day one, from approving the Keystone Pipeline to repealing Obamacare to declaring China a currency manipulator, like each one of those is a huge, huge story. And so had Romney won, I might not be here today. But, you know, as it is, on Friday I was at the White House, and it was the briefing that Jay Carney does every day. He's the White House spokesman. He hadn't been doing it lately with the campaign, and I was sitting where I always sit, second row center, the NPR seat, and I was looking around at the same people, asking about the same issues, and I felt like, oh my God, it's like $2 billion later, the last year never happened. I kind of felt like Dorothy coming back to Kansas, you know, like, did this really all just happen? But then I looked at the bags under my eyes and realized that, in fact, it had happened. Yeah. Or wait, oh, I'm sorry. I think it was this side next, right? I lost track.
So obviously a big issue was the economy in this election. My question is, why did Obama and Romney focus so much on the economy when they can't really change anything about it without congressional approval?
Just because it was what voters wanted to hear about. I mean, you know, the two things that a president can do are declare war and nominate judges or administration officials, and even then Congress has a lot of control over it. So that was what the American people wanted to hear about. The economy is really rough right now, and you would go to a town hall meeting and every question would be about the economy. So if they hadn't focused on that, they would have just been missing the boat, missing the moment that this country is in, where there are, you know, serious problems that are slowly on the path to resolution, but people want to know, when are they going to be solved and how are we going to get there? Okay, sorry, now, yeah.
Oh, it's quite all right. Do you think similarly to the Nixon-Kennedy debate, where it was a huge shift because of the introduction of television, so people could see their presidents kind of for the first time, do you think social media, and particularly memes, had a big effect?
Totally. Binders full of women, horses and bayonets, yeah. I was talking to a smaller group of students earlier today about how much Twitter has changed this election. By the end of any Romney speech, there was already a verdict on Twitter about what the important lines were, what was new, whether it succeeded or failed. Sometimes I would step off the Romney campaign for a little while, and one of my colleagues would fill in, and they would say, I haven't been listening to his speech every day for weeks. How do I know what's important? And I would say, follow the Romney press corps on Twitter, because during the speech, they're saying what's important. And the Romney, we would retweet each other. And so collectively, we had a much bigger megaphone than any of us had individually. And the staff would key in really closely to what we were saying on Twitter, because they saw that as an advantage to shape, as an opportunity to shape our stories before they were fully formed. So yeah, Twitter was huge, not just in the debates, but all throughout the campaign.
You mentioned about the foreign policy debate, how the two candidates pretty much had this agreed on all these issues.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, how did they get to the point where they, you know, reached an agreement? How did they get so similar when they've been pretty different?
Well, honestly, foreign policy was one of the areas where, and I think I say this objectively, Romney was the most muddled. He held more difficult to define positions on issues than on, even I think on domestic issues. I mean, I did a lot of in-depth stories about, so what is Romney's approach to China? What is Romney's approach to Afghanistan? What would his approach to Syria be? And on many of these, you dig down deep and you just couldn't suss out what exactly he would do as president. You know, on Syria, for example, he said, we want to unify those rebels who agree with our values and arm them. Whereas President Obama's position has been, we'll give, you know, communications and other assistance to the rebels, but we're not going to give weapons to the rebels. So, you know, on the surface, it sounds like Romney is saying we're going to do something very different from President Obama, but then when you look at that, rebels who share our values and unify them, well, how do you identify those rebels? And how do you unify them? And how do you separate them from the other rebels who might be Islamists, who you don't want to get the weapons? And so he ran as a guy with business experience, fixing the economy, who knows how jobs are created, who knows how the economy works, and that was his strong point. And I think when you dug deep into the foreign policy issues, he just didn't have as much background and didn't have as much policy knowledge as he did on some of the domestic economic stuff. Yes?
We're going to take these last 3 questions.
Okay.
And then we're going to retire for cookies.
All right. There are dozens of cookies binders full of cookies back there.
Hi, because you're speaking at a college today which has a lot of students that are trying to find a guide for a career, especially since a lot of people finish their associate's degree here and then move on to 4-year school to get a bachelor's degree in something. I'm curious to see what led you to major in journalism and have a career in that, and more specifically, what, because you said you've been with NPR your entire career, what was something that said to you, this is where I want to be and this is the right place?
So I actually didn't major in journalism, I majored in English, which I think is actually an important point, because majoring in journalism assumes that you know what you are going to do and you were just on a path there. And to me, majoring in any liberal arts field, whether it's political science or journalism or philosophy or psychology, whatever, it's not about studying Chaucer or Milton or Faulkner or Keynes or Hayek or whatever political scientist or economist you're studying. It's about learning how to read and write and think, and learning how to make complicated ideas digestible and understandable. So, you know, in college, when I would read a Shakespeare play and write a paper on it, I'm not going to use that information about Shakespeare in my job. But the ability to take a complicated text and say, okay, here's what's interesting about this text, and here's what's important about this text, well, that text could just as easily be a Supreme Court opinion that I'm reporting on today, or a tax policy document. Now, maybe if I had majored in economics, I would be more suited to address that tax policy document, but then I might not be more suited to address, you know, the foreign policy document that's going to come next week. So that's the first thing, is that I think the most useful thing you can do in college is not learn about the specific thing that you're going to end up working on, but it's learn how to read, write, and think, because that'll be useful no matter what you end up doing. And then in terms of the specific... and then in terms of my specific career path, I never knew what I wanted to do. I always felt like if you say that your goal in life is to be the CEO of Ford, and you grow up to be the CEO of General Motors, you're going to feel like a failure, you know? Whereas if your goal in life is to find something that is stimulating, challenging, interesting, engaging, valuable, then there are 1,000 different places where you could feel like you attained your goal. And so when I graduated from college, I applied for 100 different things that I thought could potentially be interesting. And 99 of them I was rejected for. But one thing that I got was an internship at NPR. And when my internship was ending, I started looking again far and wide for another job. And at the last minute, something opened up on Morning Edition, which is the morning news program. And that was a 6-month temporary position that turned into a permanent position. And I just have always loved what I'm doing there. And it's never where I planned to end up or thought I would end up, but I can't imagine any place that I would enjoy working more. Yes?
Maybe this is a follow-up question with your career as a journalist. What are your, are there any goals that you'd like to achieve as a journalist in which you are able to sort of, as a journalist, you'd like to, you'd like to achieve, I guess?
You know, there's no one specific thing that I want to do, but I always feel like when I can say something useful and memorable and impactful, when I can keep a person in their car, even if it makes them late for work, like, that's a really great moment. I mean, and so many of those stories are not the stories about the news, but like, my favorite thing is to take, I think radio is a very intimate medium where you can relate to people much more easily than, certainly in print, but even on TV, because you don't have all the superficial stuff that separates you from them. You just hear their voice. And on the radio, it feels like somebody's talking directly to you. And so, to me, many of the most compelling stories, my favorite ones that I've done, have been just average people in extraordinary moments. So I remember, for example, when the Martin Luther King Memorial opened on the National Mall, I was going to do a story about President Obama and race and how he has handled race in his presidency. And so I went to the mall to the opening of the MLK Memorial and talked to a bunch of people, sort of interviewing them for this story. But then I sat down and started talking to this one guy who told me, he was an old man, and he said, I was here on the mall when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. And he said, and I remember my grandmother telling stories about watching slaves come up the street to the fields where they were working. And to sit here now at the foot of this memorial and see this man here enshrined on the National Mall, and a black man in the White House, he said, he said, you live long enough and you'll see some things. And it's just like moments like that are why I love doing journalism. Like, to be able to capture that. And so, you know, I got back to my office and I said, okay, I'm doing this story on Obama and race, but can we just have like a 3-minute block in a show to just let this man speak? And they did, and there I feel like I'm doing a public service. Like, I'm sharing a voice that needs to be heard with who would never otherwise be heard. You know, like, Mitt Romney's going to be heard no matter what I do. But, like, nobody would have heard this guy otherwise. So to me, like, that's the goal, is to get those moments and to give them to people.
I'm sorry, my question's a little bit late for this conversation, but I just wanted to ask you, you said you saw a side of Mitt Romney that most people don't see. And I wondered if you'd had any interaction with Mrs. Romney or the family, because they're sort of unofficially running too.
Right. So I had a lot of interaction with Mrs. Romney.
And a lot of surprise at the end. They seem to not have the concession speech prepared.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you ever had any inkling that they thought they could lose it and how it affected the family.
So, two different questions. I do think that they believed they were going to win, but realized that they could lose. I think Mitt believed that more than Ann. Ann, I think, was 100% convinced they were going to win. Mitt, I think, at the end felt like there was momentum, there was a wave, there was a surge, they were going to pull it out, but I think he knew there was a chance that he wouldn't. And I think I know for a fact that he didn't write a concession speech until he knew that he'd lost, which could have been partly superstition, or it could have just been, I'm not sure. But I spent a lot of time with Ann. I spent less time, but some with the sons. I really felt badly for Ann because I think no matter who the candidate is, being the spouse is a lot harder than being the guy running for office. Because the guy running for office decided to do this, took it on, is steering the ship, is, you know, braced for all the abuse that he knows is going to rain down on him. And the spouse just sort of has to watch this guy she loves be put through the ringer, as any candidate is of any party running for public office, especially national office. And early on in the campaign, when there were just a few reporters traveling with Romney, she was really warm towards us, almost parental. She was really sweet. She was looking out for us, make sure, you know, if you guys had enough to eat, are you okay, are you rested up, blah, blah, blah. But I think as the press coverage towards her husband became less positive, she sort of took it personally and became a little less warm towards us. Still, towards the end, she would come to the back of the plane and, you know, hand out pastries or whatever. But I know it was hard for her, and it was also exhausting for her. You know, she has multiple sclerosis, and so she couldn't keep up the intense campaign schedule that he did. I'm sure she would have liked to, but she needed to rest, to eat well, to exercise, to do all the things that you cannot do when you're campaigning full time. So I felt badly for her. I thought it was really hard on her. And I thought she was a very nice, likable, good person. Thank you all so much. I've really enjoyed this, and I appreciate your coming out for it. Thanks a lot. Please join us for cookies in the back.